Welcome to Pop Crime TV's The Outlier Podcast. I'm your host, Lauren Conlin, and I debated on whether or not to cover this story today, or I guess even how it would be possible to cover this story without getting it removed from the internet, because it's just so unspeakable, vile, horrific, and almost unbelievable at times. So, with that said, I will issue a trigger warning that this episode contains allegations of abuse, SA, and crimes against children. But please, please stay with me here because this is a really important case and an important story. And that being said, I won't get into some of the very specific allegations, but I will include links in the episode notes where you can read about some of them at your own risk. And to be perfectly frank with you, I have shed a lot of tears over this story. For the victims, for the survivors, and also, just a bit of a spoiler alert, the fact that this case appears to be in limbo and no one has legally been held accountable or convicted. There is a horrific victim impact statement from 2012, and I will explain what that is later on and what it pertains to, but there are a number of people accused in that victim impact statement. And again, this victim impact statement is from 2012, and to my knowledge, I don't really know if any of those people named have been investigated. And look, law enforcement doesn't owe us anything, so yeah, they could be investigating them as we speak. I just can't conclusively say that they are or not. And I want to be clear that I do believe these victims and I do believe the survivors here. And I believe them after praying for a few days, researching this case, because when you get your hands on this information and all of these documents, it really is so horrific that you almost compartmentalize things and you don't want to believe it. So I will be using the word allegedly, as again, no one has been convicted. And while there are over 20 people that have been accused on that statement, I may only name one or two of them, but in no way, shape, or form am I instructing anyone to go out and harass them or do anything like that. Their names have been out there on public forums. I think one of the couples named in the document has also a lawsuit out on somebody that was covering this case, although I don't know all of the details. But if you are a crime junkie, you won't be surprised to hear that many of the people named were prominent figures in the community. This case and this story is truly mind-blowing. There are allegations of child SA, child abuse, and this is going to sound crazy, but demonic, ritualistic, cult sacrifices involving children. And I am reading this and I'm like, no, 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 this is too sick, this is too evil, I just don't believe it. And my friend, Frank Zell, who actually brought this case to my attention, he said something to me like, what's that saying, Newton's third law? For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. So if I believe that Jesus is my Lord and Savior, I guess that means that the opposite of that would be Satan and the devil could be someone else's savior. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I want to just shout out Frank Zell again, and I have plugged his website, inthezeller.com, who brought this case to my attention, and he and his brother investigate a lot of cases, most notably the JonBenet Ramsey case, and Frank just provided a foundation for my research here. And this case is so complex. There is absolutely no way I could squeeze everything into one episode. So I do plan on doing a few follow-up episodes. So today it's going to be a bit top level, if that makes sense. I'm going to lay the foundation. I'm not going to get into all of the prosecutors' names, all of the judges' names, and all of the names listed on the document. And also, I know that YouTube, for one, censors a lot of these words that I have to use to properly convey all of the details here. So bear with me as I may use words that rhyme and pronounce them oddly. I do apologize for that, but it's just tough to talk about this case without mentioning the very serious and disturbing allegations. But the purpose of this episode is to shed light on the injustice of what happened in Utah and could still be happening. I'm willing to bet this is happening as I record this episode, and that makes me sick. And maybe if enough people make noise here, the cases that I'm about to get into will finally be prosecuted. Let's start here in Provo, Utah, with a man named David Lee Hamblin, who was married to a woman named Roselle Anderson Stevenson, formerly Hamlin. They have 3 daughters, and they are no longer married. I will reference a custody battle that they went through in 2003, but presently, Hamblin is around 70 years old, and Stevenson is 71 or 72 years old. David Lee Hamblin was a former therapist. He has since lost his license, but he was a well-known therapist and a somewhat high-ranking member of the Jesus Christ Church of Latter-day Saints. And the Church of LDS could be generalized as the Mormon Church, as that's what a lot of people think of when they hear LDS. And their religious journey in the Bible starts in the New Testament as opposed to the Old Testament. Now, the Hamblin family bloodlines date back to the earliest days of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. However, David Lee Hamblin and his family, as well as many of his friends, were allegedly high-ranking members of the Church of Satan. And David Lee Hamblin allegedly was just following in the footsteps of his bloodlines, his father and his father and his father, and so on. I mentioned David and Rosie Hamblin having 3 daughters, and those daughters are now adults in their 30s and 40s. All 3 of the Hamblin daughters were born in the 1980s, so quick spoiler alert, we know of David Lee Hamblin's behavior, these allegations, these disgusting allegations, and about the worshiping at the Church of Satan because of David Lee Hamblin's daughters. So was he allegedly engaging in this horrific activity before the 1980s? Most likely, I would definitely speculate, yeah, he was. But all we have documented is from the 1980s on. I ran a background check on Hamblin with this software that I use, and I did find an arrest in 1990 for aggravated SA of a child. However, there are no documents or actual physical records of this, so I'm assuming that they are either sealed or he got this wiped. There is another arrest for him in 1999, also with no records, but I know a little bit about this arrest because, and you'll hear about it later on, because I have heard it talked about in a press conference. But this arrest was for wanton destruction of protected wildlife. And this is because he allegedly killed a deer and used it as some kind of sacrifice or ritualistic sacrifice, used his blood. I mean, I don't know all of the details, but the definition in Utah of wanton destruction of protected wildlife is as follows. Quote, wanton destruction of protected wildlife in Utah is the intentional, knowing, or reckless capture, injury, or destruction of a protected animal. It can also include abandoning a protected animal and its carcass, end quote. Now, that case was eventually settled, but it was prosecuted by a prosecutor by the name of David Leavitt. So remember that name because we are going to talk about David Leavitt later on. And by the way, that could be considered a felony, which could result in jail time, but I believe David Lee Hamblin just had to pay some kind of fine. Let's now forward to 2012, where things get real. David Lee Hamblin is arrested and charged in 4th District Court with 18 first-degree felonies, including sodomy on a child, multiple counts of rape on a child, and aggravated SA of a child spanning from the 1980s to the mid 2000s. And it was David's eldest daughter that came forward to the Provo Police Department. After she came forward, her two sisters wrote a 150-page victim impact statement corroborating everything she said and so much more. This is what I had been referring to earlier in the episode. And I really don't have the words for this document. I really don't. And honestly, I couldn't read it all. I could not read it all in detail. It was too horrific. They validated all of the charges against their father, David Lee Hamblin, and more. It's beyond my comprehension. These three sisters, the Hamlin sisters, allegedly endured something that is out of your worst nightmare. Actually, I'm going to go as far as to say that I don't think any of you would ever even have nightmares of what they went through, allegedly, because it's so horrific. They were allegedly victims of both of their parents SAing and rhymes with grape ing them on a weekly, if not daily basis. And I'm going to describe the Church of Satan as the CS moving forward, so I don't have to say it anymore. But the sisters describe that it wasn't just their parents who did this to them. It was their parents' friends and relatives and everyone in the CS from when they were babies until their very late teen years. The sisters were payments to people in CS. People in the CS could come and abuse the sisters however they wanted to, whenever they wanted to, because they had some type of understanding with the Hamblins. And not only that, but they describe when their father would use them in these therapy sessions for his patients, allowing his patients to then do whatever they wanted to them. And these sisters, they were allegedly brutally beat and abused on a very regular basis. And this abuse, it's not just physical. They were allegedly forced to eat feces and other bodily fluid. They were allegedly impregnated by their father, grandfather, and others just for the sole purpose of aborting the baby for sacrificial purposes. And they alleged that Hamblin and their mother and a large group of their friends participated in these satanic, ritualistic sacrificings of aborted babies, live babies, children, and more. And I know this sounds too horrific for words and almost too outlandish to be true, but please stay with me here. And many of you might be wondering, well, how did they get away with this for so long if there were other children and other babies who were allegedly sacrificed? Well, they got these children and these babies allegedly from tribal lands or polygamous colonies where they didn't have a birth certificate. I'm also just scratching the surface here of what these women went through. I'm not even getting into the horrific, disturbing detail of this 150-page document. And by the way, it was sealed, of course, for a time. However, until it was leaked to the public years later, and some of the people that were named as participating in the beatings, the SA and the CS, as I mentioned earlier, were pretty notable members of the community, like an artist named Lee Benyon and her husband. And Lee still paints, and you can find her work readily accessible online. And The daughters named a future district attorney / former prosecutor named David Leavitt, who I mentioned earlier. They also named his wife Chelom. The Leavitts and the Hamblins knew each other well, it turns out. They were actually neighbors for a while. But before I go on to tell you what followed the 2012 arrest of David Lee Hamblin and the eldest Hamblin daughter bravely coming forward and her sisters bravely documenting everything, let's go back to 2003. And the information I'm about to share comes from a 490-page document from a person that was hired to privately investigate all of the sisters' allegations. And as I said, they are so evil that they're hard to believe. However, this investigator was able to interview 97 people and corroborate what the Hamblin daughters alleged. But more on that later. So back in 2003, Rosie and David Hamblin were going through a divorce and they were going through a custody battle. The court in Hamblin's custody trial found, by clear and convincing evidence, that he had SA'd 2 of the Hamblin sisters that were still minors. Now, despite this, the Utah County Attorney's Office declined to prosecute David Hamblin. And during this trial, they also got Hamblin to admit to administering peyote to his minor children as part of his combination of Native American religious practices with his theories on the LDS church priesthood and, quote, parts that Hamblin believed he could either create in his children or cast out of them. So, despite the fact that administering a controlled substance to a minor or a child is not protected under any theory or religious liberty, and in spite of the actual reality that the possession of peyote in general was illegal in Utah at the time, combine this with the admitted sexual abuse, David Lee Hamblin evaded prosecution here. And if you're wondering, no, he was not prosecuted by David Leavitt, but David Leavitt actually came in and testified on behalf of Roselle Stevenson, or formerly Roselle Hamblin, that she should have the kids instead. But you'll hear more about that later. But this was seemingly another indication that possibly David Lee Hamblin had connections at the Utah County Attorney's Office, since he continued to avoid getting arrested, avoid being prosecuted, despite the fact that he was committing illegal activity. Can you imagine being David's daughters and seeing all this unfold, seeing the corruption unfold in real time? I cannot imagine how hopeless they must have felt. And then also knowing that they still had to live with their disgusting, allegedly abusive mother. I mean, I pray for the Hamblin sisters every day, and I just continue to be in awe of them. I don't know how they got out of bed every morning. I don't know how they continue to get out of bed. They are just incredibly strong women. But let's go back to 2012. 18 different disturbing counts against David Lee Hamblin. Now, the Provo Police Department actually managed to record Hamblin before he was arrested, and he actually apologized to his eldest daughter for graping her. He reportedly said, quote, "I am sorry for graping you. I'm not saying it isn't true. I'm not saying somebody in my body didn't do it." End quote. And I would love to hear this recording. I would love to get my hands on it. I don't know where it is. But here is where you're going to start screaming. 2 years go by. It's now 2014. The Utah County Attorney's Office dismisses the charges without prejudice on the grounds that they were having difficulty getting discovery to Hamblin's defense team. So, dismissing the charges without prejudice means they could refile them and charge him again, But what? Seriously? The entire case is just dismissed against him? Okay, got it. So I'm going to say alleged corruption to the highest degree once again. So, what the Provo Police Department did was they forwarded their case files to the Department of Homeland Security, where two special agents began investigating the case. By 2020, they were ready to interview other named survivors and victims within the Hamlin sisters' victim impact statement, as well as police reports. But then COVID hit, and that resulted in shutdowns, and it really just ended and hindered their ability to travel to interview these people. So the investigation was halted. And sadly, by the time things started opening back up again post-COVID, both of these agents were reassigned to other cases. So once again, the David Lee Hamblin case was in this state of limbo. But then the Utah County Sheriff, Mike Smith, began his investigation. Now, I don't have the exact dates of when he started this investigation. I know that it came to light in 2022, but he could have been investigating this before. I'm just not sure. So Mike Smith first focused on an illegal adoption that was brought to his attention by HSI involving the sitting Utah County DA, David Leavitt. It's funny how his name keeps coming up. He was good friends with the Hamlins at one point, he and his wife Chelom, and they were neighbors, and he testified on behalf of Roselle Stevenson that she should have her children. Well, according to the Hamlin sisters, David and Chelom Leavitt were alleged members of the CS, and they accused Leavitt and Chelom of graping them and also providing at least one polygamist little boy for a ritual sacrifice in Spring City, Utah. And the illegal adoption that Mike Smith was looking into was the adoption of an indigenous child on tribal land. And that terrifies me for that child because David Leavitt and his wife were successful with that adoption, and it apparently caused quite the stir. You can Google that. Leavitt did all these local interviews about it, and I believe he was even the subject of some kind of documentary where he actually says some other interesting things that are later held against him. Now, at some point in 2022, it becomes clear that Sheriff Mike Smith is very interested in reopening the 2012 case against David Lee Hamblin. Now, coupled with that, the Hamlin sisters' victim impact statement is leaked, and David Leavitt sees that he and his wife Chelom, along with other high-profile members of the community, are named. And not only are they named, but that impact statement went into disturbing and disgusting detail, okay? So this prompts him to hold a ridiculous press conference because 2022, well, that's a re-election year for him. Leavitt decides that it's a good idea to hold a press conference claiming that all of this is politically motivated, it's outlandish. And before I play the press conference, because guys, you have to hear this, I need to fill you in on one more element. Leavitt also accuses Sheriff Mike Smith and his team of colluding with a criminal named Arthur Knight. He ran a website called ZeusNewsNow.com, and he was the reason that the victim impact statement was leaked. He published it on the site and was constantly pushing for Leavitt and his wife to be prosecuted. Now, it turns out Arthur Knight was actually a man named Nicholas Rossi. He's also known as Nicholas Oliverdian, and he actually faked his own death in 2020, but was eventually extradited from Scotland after being hospitalized for COVID. That's how he was, quote, captured. And Nicholas Rossi was on the run because he was charged and accused of graping a woman in Utah in 2008. And who was prosecuting that case? David Leavitt. There was actually a whole Dateline episode about this guy, Nicholas Rossi. And I believe he's actually going to trial soon. I saw on the news that he recently rejected a plea. Now, I always say multiple things can be true. Rossi fled because he possibly knew he was guilty, and then he wanted to stick it to David Leavitt by exposing these horrific allegations. I don't really know the deal with Nicholas Rossi or Arthur Knight, but I believe the allegations against David Leavitt and his wife. And yes, it's very convenient for David Leavitt to lean into the fact that he prosecuted this guy and Nicholas Rossi was just getting back at him for that. And then, like I said, Leavitt accuses the police of conspiring with an alleged criminal for political gain. And I'm going to play another clip for you guys later. That was a huge red flag for me when David Leavitt actually gave an interview on News Nation about Rossi. And after hearing this press conference, guys, it will all make sense. And then just for fun, as a side note, you should count how many times David Leavitt refers to the accuser, who we know as the eldest Hamlin sister, as, quote, tragically mentally ill. I swear, he says this like 10 times. It is so insulting. And I just want to remind you that after this, 97 people were interviewed by an investigator and corroborated everything that the Hamlin sisters said. And David Leavitt, in this press conference, he contradicts himself a lot. And the reporters at the end, I mean, that is my favorite part of this whole press conference. It's when they just hammer him with questions and they call him out, and it is so good. This presser is about 23 minutes. I actually had it on 1.5 speed, but I promise you it is worth it. You have to listen to the whole thing, and you'll hear certain things that I have referenced in the episode earlier.
Since the beginning of my term, I have tried to do everything possible to rebuild the trust that law enforcement, prosecutors, and police have lost with the public. Our society demands that we be able to trust our public officials. I want to talk to you about two separate cases. The first case involves a man by the name of Nicholas Rossi. Nicholas Rossi allegedly raped a woman in Orem, Utah in 2008. That case was reported to law enforcement. It went uninvestigated largely. Her rape exam, the victim's rape exam, went untested for 12 years. Until shortly, around the time I took office, we ensured that it was tested. That rape kit produced evidence that a convicted sex offender in Ohio, Nicholas Rossi, was the suspect. We engaged in a lengthy investigation involving the State Bureau of Investigation, the United States Department of Justice, the Scottish authorities, for reasons that I'll disclose, which you may already know, but I'll disclose in a moment, that revealed that Nicholas Rossi was also going by the name of Arthur Knight, that he'd faked his own death, relocated to Scotland, and we located him in a hospital bed in Scotland suffering from COVID. He's now awaiting extradition on charges which I levied against him for the 2008 rape of the Utah County resident. Nicholas Rossi's MO, his mode of operation, has been to take on people who accuse him or who threaten him or who in any way stand in his way with vile crimes, with blackmail, with extortion. And there's a lengthy history and pattern of Nicholas Rossi doing that. Now, he's engaged in that process against me and my wife, making all sorts of allegations that are completely groundless in an effort to shift the attention from his alleged crimes in Utah to something that's a complete farce. That's the first case. The second case involved a local therapist and centered around an allegation made by one tragically mentally ill woman who was that therapist's daughter. She accused him and 15 or 20 other members of the community from being involved in horrific crimes. That investigation, that allegation by that tragically mentally ill woman was so outlandish and so ludicrous that our own fine Special Victims Task Force that investigates these kinds of crimes refused to even interview any of the 15 or 20 people who are alleged to have committed these crimes. The case resulted in criminal charges against one individual, the tragically mentally ill woman's father. And my predecessor, Jeff Buman, ultimately dismissed that case against the therapist because the evidence was so outlandish and so unbelievable. That therapist had his record expunged recently, his arrest expunged recently, and should be out of the public record. Because law enforcement is about trust. It's about being able to say that when the government makes an allegation, that there's substance behind it that we can believe in. And if there's not, then we have a process whereby people can have their names restored, which is the process through which this therapist went. Yesterday, I was provided a copy of an alleged witness statement of that tragically mentally ill woman. And for the first time in reportedly 15 or 20 years since the report was given, I learned that my wife and I were part of those allegations, alleging that we were guilty of cannibalizing young children and murdering young children. This morning at 3:30 approximately in the morning, Nicholas Rossi, posing as Arthur Knight, posted to the internet allegations that I am a suspect along with my wife in this crime. It follows Nicholas Rossi's mode of operating, and it does nothing but demean the integrity of me, my wife, and 15 or 20 other members of this community who had absolutely nothing to do with a discredited case from 15 years ago. What's problematic for me and troubling to me is that Nicholas Rossi seems to corroborate Fox 13 News assertions that high-profile individuals are involved, and he names me and my wife. And Nicholas Rossi, again, lists Sergeant Spencer Cannon of the Utah County Sheriff's Office as the source for confirming that I indeed am a suspect in crimes that involve cannibalism and murder of small children. That this all occurs less than 1 week before ballots drop in an election in which I am participating causes me tremendous concern over the credibility and the actions and the connections between a convicted sex offender, Nicholas Rossi, and the Utah County Sheriff's Office. And I am calling upon Sheriff Mike Smith to open his office to an outside investigation where outside independent investigators are able to investigate and confirm or deny that documents from a debunked investigation of more than a decade ago were or were not used for political purposes in a Utah County attorney's race. And I call upon Mike Smith to suspend Sergeant Spencer Cannon pending that investigation to determine whether the Utah County Attorney's Office that dismissed charges by my predecessor 12 years ago, whether those charges were dismissed by my predecessor because the allegations were so untenable and unbelievable, and whether the Utah County Sheriff's Office is providing those kinds of documents to political opponents to be used for political purposes. I would call upon Mike Smith, Sheriff Mike Smith, to shed a little more light on his investigation that he announced yesterday. Because the tie that he seeks to make with Nicholas Rossi, a convicted sex offender awaiting extradition on rape charges in Utah, are undeniable. And I challenge Sheriff Smith not only to open his office for an investigation, not only to suspend Spencer Cannon pending that investigation, but to resign himself if it can be demonstrated that his office is being used for such illicit political purposes. That we would stoop in this society to something as disgusting as the 151-page pack of lies that was given to me from the news media. Disheartens me, angers me. We deserve more from our public officials, and we deserve more from the news media to respectfully and responsibly ferret out what is true and what is not. I encourage Mike Smith to open his office to an investigation to find out how the news media received this document, who created it, if it was not in fact part of the initial case, which I don't know. And I challenge Mike Smith to find out, to open his office for an investigation so that we may find out how in the world did Nicholas Rossi, a convicted sex offender and alleged rapist in Utah County, get the same document. And to open his office for an investigation to understand how his PIO allegedly confirmed that my wife and I are subjects of that investigation, alleging that we are guilty of cannibalism of children and murder of children. And I encourage Mike Smith, if he can, to vindicate himself, that this is not done for his political purposes, for the political purposes of those who seek to eliminate me from this office. And if there is such a link, then I call upon him to resign. Because rebuilding trust in law enforcement is bigger than me, it's bigger than him, it's bigger than all of us. We cannot have a stable civil society without implicit trust in our law enforcement. Now let me say this. Having read the 151 pages of utter baloney, my heart goes out to the 15 or 20 innocent citizens whose names are implicated, whose reputations are besmirched. I'm sorry that someone's effort at eliminating me as an elected prosecutor has hurt you. To the tragically mentally ill woman, I'm sorry that someone, for pure political, unvarnished gain, is using your trauma and your heartache for their gain. And if you'll allow me a moment of personal preference, let me say, my wife of 33 years, with whom we have had 8 children, who is a reputable member of the Utah State Bar and a respected university PhD researcher, is the kindest, most gentle, most loving person that I've ever known in my life. And for her to have her reputation, her professional character, and everything about her life work brought into question by a few cheap political opportunists offends me to the greatest depth of my being. I call on Mike Smith to apologize to my family, to my wife. Spencer Cannon to apologize to my wife, the victim, the 15 or 20 other people who are victims of this. I call upon them to apologize to a tragically ill, mentally ill woman who yet again will suffer the scars. Not for anything that will benefit her, but for somebody else's cheap political gain. I will end where I began. My aim as a Utah County attorney is to build trust in this community that you can trust the prosecutor and the law enforcement officials that seek to protect you, that seek to put the violent and dangerous in prison, that seek redemptive solutions for the nonviolent. To the extent that my partners in law enforcement have participated in cheap political tricks and using their power and their authority and the taxpayers' money for their own political gain, I ask them to step aside. I'm open for any questions.
Mr. Leavitt, did you know at the time in 2012 that you and your wife were subjects of this investigation?
No, I had no idea.
Investigation?
I had no idea. And I will say that understanding the care and the skill with which the Special Victims Task Force do their job, the fact that I had no idea that I was part of that, the fact that none of the 15 or 20 probably had no idea. And if you read, when you read the 151 pages, I'm confident that you will see for yourself that it is absolutely ludicrous. And so I had no idea until yesterday.
We read that. What do you say to the sheriff's office saying they have multiple victims of this child sex ring that have come forward? That would contradict what you're saying, that this is just one mentally ill victim.
Let's bring them forward. Let's put this in the light of day. And maybe while we're at it, let's find out why, if this is a 25-year investigation, why is it occurring 7 days before the ballots drop in my election? And if this truly was an investigation that has been having since April of 2021, and if there truly are federal agencies and other state agencies that are participating in this, who are they? Let's name the agencies. Let's get them involved. Let's find out who it is. Yes, I welcome that.
You want the sheriff to step aside as well as Sergeant Cannon. Do you think you need to step aside while this investigation plays out?
Absolutely not, because the allegation that I am asserting is that the sheriff's office is using its position for political gain. I'm not accusing him of abusing and cannibalizing and murdering children. And no, I will not step aside. Yeah.
Can you share a little bit more about the circumstances with which this case ended or stopped or was dismissed, how it came to be that there were these allegations and charges and then the investigation halted?
Well, this case was dismissed almost 10 years before I took office.
And you have access to the case file then, right?
I can find it. Yeah, it's in the archive someplace.
Have you not looked at it?
No, it's going to take several pages. We were not paperless in that time frame. And what I'm doing is trying to be completely transparent and above board, and I will make those files available to the extent they are allowed under the law. I have nothing to hide. What's going to be interesting to me is if the 151 pages that we all have is in that witness file.
You have criticized law enforcement and whoever has released this document, but you're now saying you will release more documents.
I think what I said was, let me clarify. Mm-hmm. To the extent that such documents are allowable to be released under the law, and to the extent there are appropriate grandma requests for such documents, we will release them. However, we will not slip them to political adversaries. We will not slip them to political consultants. We will not slip them to alleged rapists to try and discredit the prosecutor. We will follow the law, and if the documents may be released, we will release them.
Do you have an anticipated timeline for that?
No, I don't know how long it will take to find it. I mean, this was a case that was prosecuted and dismissed 10 years ago before I took office. And I really want to call out Fox 13. Are they here? Is that you? Shame on your news station. Shame on Adam Hurwitz for asserting that the Utah County Attorney's Office dismissed a charge of rape without clarifying that case was dismissed 10 years ago by my predecessor. And I expect more of you as an individual and more of you as a news organization.
Mr. Leavitt, Spencer Cannon denies confirming anything to the article that was published in England. Don't you think it's possible that Rosie was just making this up?
Absolutely possible. That's why we need to have an investigation. Yes, but we don't want to have the person who is the subject of that investigation have access to his text messages, to his emails, to his phone records while that investigation is pending.
Have you had any communication with the sheriff's office about your request today for investigation?
No.
When you were the Juab County attorney, did you know anything about allegations of a sex ring, ritualistic sex abuse going on in Sanpete, Juab, and Utah counties? You would have been the county attorney during the timeline.
I prosecuted the therapist in Juab County for poaching a deer. He pled guilty. It's been 20 years ago or more. He poached a deer to use for ritualistic purposes. He pled guilty to it, as I recall. And was I aware of any kind of ritualistic ring? No, I was not.
Could you characterize?
You're saying there that he killed that deer for a ritual purpose.
For his home,
he killed
the deer for a Native American ceremony, not dealing in sex, murder, and cannibalism.
Did you investigate that?
No, I did not.
That it didn't involve sex?
Because there were no allegations of it. The case was brought to me by the Department of Natural Resources for a deer poaching case, and I prosecuted the deer poaching case. Now, everyone should know, if you don't know already, that when I was a law student, this therapist was my elders quorum president in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was my neighbor. I had a family connection. When his wife learned of whatever he was doing, she divorced him, and I testified at that divorce hearing. I'm well aware of who the therapist is, and I'm well aware of many of the players here, but For example, I've never in my life I've never been to Spring City, Utah. I could probably find my way there in Sanpete County, but I've never been there. I mean, the allegations that are there are so outlandish and so crazy that they're just not true. And let me be clear: when the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for whom I do not speak, found out about this person's conduct, they kicked him. Right? I mean, there is nothing. There is no organized ring of abuse. It was debunked more than 10 years ago. It was dismissed by someone not in any respect affiliated with me. And it wasn't even investigated in a serious way by the Sex Crimes Task Force of Utah County. Now, I would suggest to you, if they didn't investigate it, that would suggest that it's because the story is just so crazy.
How can you say that confidently, though, when you've already told us today you haven't reviewed the case file? How can you stand here and confidently say that this was a justifiably dismissed case when you've already told us you haven't seen the case?
I have already told you that I knew who the therapist was. And I had a conversation with the deputy county attorney in this office that prosecuted the case, Dave Sturgill. I had that conversation many years ago and asked about the status of the case, and he told me they dismissed it because the evidence was so outlandish.
Back when you had that conversation, you did not know that you were named in the case file.
I had no idea.
And can you characterize your relationship with this therapist today?
I haven't seen him in a decade.
Have you talked to him?
I haven't seen or talked to him. I've had no communication, directly or indirectly. I don't even know where he lives. I have no idea his whereabouts. He could be across the street for all I know. He could be in South America. I don't know. He is a man who was my former neighbor. And I had a friendship with he and his wife to the extent that I went into court and testified on behalf of his wife to protect his children from him, which is why I asked Dave Sturgill why the case had been dismissed. And Dave Sturgill's comment was because the evidence was just crazy.
But you yourself have not reviewed the case.
No.
Would you be open to federal authorities, the U.S. Attorney's Office or the FBI coming in and investigating this?
Anyone with the proper authority, absolutely. I have nothing to hide.
But you are, just to be clear, definitively saying what the Utah County Sheriff's Office is investigating with regards to the ritual sex ring is not true. Those allegations are false.
I don't know what they're investigating, but if it has anything to do with this therapist and the report of 25 years ago, that is 100% false.
Then how can you call for his resignation? You just said you don't know what they're investigating, but you're calling for the sheriff to resign for misuse of county resources. And when you just said you don't know what they're
Let's be
investigating.
clear. I'm saying if the sheriff, everyone get your notepads out here. If it can be demonstrated that the sheriff has used his office for political purposes, and there is no evidence of that I would bring to court, but if an investigation can demonstrate that, then I'm saying the sheriff should resign.
That sounds like a stretch, though, from what we're here for. You're saying we're calling on the sheriff to resign. We want Spencer Cannon suspended over this, but you're admitting you don't really know the facts of that case.
How are you connecting their press release with these cases? Because it seems that you just said you don't know that they're connected.
Oh, they're connected.
Then can you share how you know that?
What I'll do for you is I'll put together graphics that make the connection. All right. Instead of me speaking off the cuff and saying something that might get a detail wrong, I'll provide the links and the graphics that demonstrate that.
When?
Whenever I have it prepared. I mean, this wasn't on my docket of things to do yesterday.
Mr. Leavitt, how is not a conflict of interest that you're calling for the resignation of the sheriff over an investigation of which, by your own admission, you and your wife are suspects?
Me and my wife are not suspects in an investigation.
You said you were involved in the allegations. I mean, you made that.
I am not
yourself.
a suspect in a criminal investigation.
Then what is this about your wife's reputation being tarnished? If you and her are not suspects.
Just because you wind up in a police report with someone making an allegation does not make you a suspect. A suspect is someone that a governmental agency is asserting that you are guilty of criminal wrongdoing. Just because, I mean, you could wind up in the police report. Does that make you a suspect?
Not necessarily, but
I
you're
agree.
saying that you were received
You
by
are
the
levying
mentally ill
some
woman. You said
strong
it yourself.
accusations. You're levying some strong accusations. You're almost accusing people of throwing out allegations that have no basis in our lives, but there doesn't seem to be a lot of factual basis to your concerns or calling on investigation while also calling for a resignation. Can you share any more why you think that is an appropriate step at this point?
Nicholas Rossi has evidence of allegations from 20 years ago.
But you don't know how he got those?
I can't say for certain how he got those. I don't know. I will say his lawyer, Craig Johnson, was a deputy county attorney in this office and who I fired or forced to resign for accepting jazz tickets when he had cases pending from attorneys from whom he had cases pending. Now, and also Craig Johnson and Mike Smith and Mike Smith campaign consultant are all working together against me in my political campaign. Now, if to be responsible, and I'm not trying to hide anything here. I'm holding a press conference for crying out loud and talking about this. To be responsible, I will provide a graphic of the linkage. Yes, that's all I've got, unless I think I've answered your questions. Any other questions?
Just why not go to the sheriff's office directly? Why do it publicly?
I suppose I'd ask the same question to the sheriff.
But the sheriff never mentioned you. They never confirmed you. We asked them specifically yesterday. They declined to comment.
Let me ask you this. Why did you ask the sheriff specifically if I were part of it?
We asked them specifically, will you name names? They said, we're not naming names.
Right. They don't need to do that because Nicholas Rossi is the person who's naming them for them. Thank you.
There are so many things about that press conference. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, the beginning, right off the bat, he's trying to play a hero and bash the police department for not investigating this 2008 grape properly. I mean, yeah, I'm not going to get into all of it. You guys heard it with your own ears. But needless to say, David Leavitt did not win re-election in 2022. But you know what did happen in 2022? 2 more survivors of David Lee Hamblin came forward, and he was arrested again in September of 2022, just a few months after that press conference. And he was arrested on 3 counts of odd-amy on a child, grape of a child, 2 counts of aggravated SA of a child, lewdness involving a child, and a month later, new charges were added when another survivor came forward. And according to Fox 13, quote, alleged victim Brett Bluth described a long period of abuse and grooming by Hamblin as he tried to, quote, heal Bluth of his homosexuality. Bluth expressed optimism that charges would be filed against Hampton. Quote, I do think it'll be different this time, Bluth said. Hypnosis was a big part of my treatment. He told me from the very beginning that this was his main technique. Bluth said Hamblin spent hours each week trying to convince Bluth that he was abused during his childhood and that he had multiple personality disorder due to systemic ritual and SA. He had this yellow notepad with lined papers of notes, and he would read them back to me saying, this is what one of your personalities said when you were under hypnosis, Bluth said. I told him I was never under, but I went home from those sessions thinking that I had hurt other people. Bluth then said Hamblin hinted at the need for his patient to perform sex acts for several months in order to be cured of his homosexuality. Quote, he started suggesting that the semen of a righteous man would then undo the damage that the semen of the unrighteous man had done. Bluth described. He put his arm on the back of the sofa, and he put his other arm back, and we waited. And we sat there in silence. He put his hands on my head and gave me a Mormon priesthood and blessed the SPERM. End quote. That is incredibly disturbing, and my heart goes out to him. And this case, I mean, it kind of reminds me of Sean Combs, aka Diddy, a little bit, because after David Lee Hamblin was rearrested in 2022, more than 130 potential victims came forward, with officials describing the majority of those tips as, quote, credible. The case against Hamblin and the investigation into everything that was stated in these documents by the Hamblin sisters, as well as other victims, they were being investigated. And let's fast forward to the summer of 2023, a year into this investigation, when finally Rosie Anderson Stevenson, or Roselle, the ex-wife of David Hamblin and the mother of the 3 Hamblin daughters, is also arrested for the rape of a child, 2 counts of SA of a child, and 3 counts of odd-amy on a child. Now, if you think that justice is beginning to prevail, you would be wrong. Both Stevenson and Hamblin were released on bail pending their trials. Stevenson was ROR, released on her own recognizance, while Hamblin was released on a few stupid stipulations like turning over his passport and wearing an ankle monitor. And here we are, over 2 years later, and the case is still in limbo. Apparently, they can't find anyone to prosecute the case because a judge has banned the Utah County DA's office because of conflicts. I mentioned that this was a top-level review here, so I haven't FOIA requested any of the documents pertaining to this case yet, except for what's available online. I had purchased all of the arrest records and things like that. But yeah, I don't know why they can't change venues, and I certainly don't understand why this case isn't necessarily a federal case. Everything on the documents written by the Hamlin sisters would indicate that this could be considered alleged child trafficking. Everything that they went through, all of the alleged friends and family members that they were, quote, loaned to. I believe that is the definition of child trafficking. So I will do a follow-up episode. I will submit a FOIA request. You don't have to be a resident of Utah to do that. I guess the question is, will they grant me any of the information that I'm looking for? I guess we'll see. I always have to try. And just to close out this episode, this is kind of awkward, and I want to repeat myself. By me naming some of these names and going into some of these things, I am in no way telling you guys to go and harass these people, but I wanted to bring up David Leavitt's wife, Chelom Leavitt. She is a sex researcher. David Leavitt actually said in the press conference that she was a PhD researcher. Sure, that's true, but she's a sex researcher, and she has a website, and it disturbed me to my core when I saw it. It's chelomleavitt.com, where she has multiple different tabs talking about sex, and one of the tabs is teaching kids about sex. And she and David have 8 kids. And if you click on the tab that says teaching kids about sex, you'll see that you can click on you have different options, ages 0 through 7, because yeah, an infant and a toddler and an elementary school kid should definitely be taught sexuality. I'm being sarcastic. And then she has a tab that says 8 to 12-year-olds, and then, teenagers and so on. You get it. And it's vile. There are so many red flags and disturbing things on this woman's site. I don't know how this alone is not a crime. In one section, she talks about some, quote, important do's and don'ts. And I feel gross even saying this, but I am just going to give you an idea. And by the way, I'm not even going to use some of the graphic terms that she uses, because she uses graphic terms here. I will link this out in the episode notes so you can see verbatim what she said. But like I said, I'm going to soften things up a little bit because it's really gross and I don't even like repeating it. But I think it's important that I read this to you guys so you have context. Some important don'ts. Quote, "Don't shame ever. I regularly hear parents who are filled with anxiety about their 3 to 4-year-old who is masturbating. The child will be in the tub and touch their private parts. What we need to remember is that they are learning about their body. This is the age that they will find and want to learn about their privates, and touching them may even be pleasurable." Oh my God. If we openly talk about their boy private or girl private, they will feel informed and soon move on to their next discovery. End quote. What? Lady, what? Please go to this site and see the terms that she actually uses, and go ahead and explore that site. I am sick to my stomach. I mean, Chelom and David Leavitt are named in pretty much what the PROVO police have substantiated as valid. I mean, this is beyond disturbing that she actually thinks that a 3 and 4-year-old child could touch themselves for pleasure. I can't even go into it. I just think that alone right there should cause Chelom Leavitt to be looked into. And by the way, David and Chelom Leavitt, they don't live in the United States anymore. Isn't that convenient? They apparently had this lifelong dream to renovate a castle in Scotland. So that's what they're doing. And remember Scotland, that's where Nicholas Rossi fled to. I don't know if there's any connection there, but that's a weird coincidence, and I don't necessarily believe in coincidences. And the fact that they soon left the country after Roselle Stevenson was arrested, I mean, in my opinion, they saw the chips falling. Maybe they thought, okay, more people are going to be named, and we got to get out of here. Now, Leavitt was on Dan Abrams on News Nation, and he was talking about the prosecution of Nicholas Rossi. Because remember, this was a big story. It was on Dateline. And yeah, he faked his own death. He was being prosecuted by Leavitt, blah, blah, blah. Well, Dan Abrams at one point is like, man, David, this guy accused you of some horrible, disgusting stuff. Are you going to file a defamation lawsuit? And I'm paraphrasing. Dan, you'll hear it. Dan says some other things, but I'm going to play his non-answer, in my opinion. I felt like he kind of danced around the question, didn't directly answer it, because let's be honest, a defamation lawsuit would open David Leavitt up to discovery in proving all of the claims are false. And it's 2025 here. He's known about these claims for years, and I don't see any trace of a defamation lawsuit.
Are you considering legal action? I mean, this is serious stuff, right? Accusing you of being a sex trafficker.
Well, my wife is a respected sex researcher at the local university, and she has a book pending on the topic. And this has affected her in a very serious way. And absolutely, we're going to get through this election, win or lose. We're going to get to the bottom of this, because this really cannot stand for what politics should be. I am going through a tremendous sacrifice of my own reputation to bring a man to justice, and we intend to do just that, and we expect that voters will be able to see right through this.
Well, the voters were smart, and they saw through David Leavitt, because remember, he didn't get elected. Now, I have no idea right now where the investigation stands, but I mentioned I plan to make calls, send some emails, because I don't want this case, this story, these survivors to be forgotten. I hope and I pray that the FBI and Homeland Security still have eyes on this case. But I do want to share some positive news. In February of 2024, a new bill that would define and criminalize, quote, ritualistic abuse of a child did pass, and that law goes into effect this May of 2025. House Bill 196 is sponsored by Representative Ken Ivory, and it defines, quote, ritual as an event, act, or a series of events or acts marked by specific actions, gestures, or words designed to commemorate, celebrate, or solemnize a particular occasion or significance in a religious, cultural, social, institutional, or other context. Lieutenant Jason Randall with the Utah County Sheriff's Office spoke out in favor of this bill. He said, quote, it's sending a message to victims that we know these crimes exist and they are heinous. And we are putting something in the code specifically to help you. The most essential reason for this is because we have victims who are afraid to come forward because they won't be believed, because this is an aspect of sex abuse that's not even covered in our current code. End quote. I mean, this is just, it's beyond devastating. It's beyond sad, because I'm certain this is still going on to a degree. But it sounds like there is progress being made because this bill was passed into law. That is super wonderful news. But I want to close this episode by reading something. And I want to read part of the, quote, corroboration evidence portion of the investigator's 490-page document, and I do hope to follow up on this episode very soon, and you can find everything I reference in the episode notes, along with the number to the Provo Police Department if you have any additional information. Quote, corroborating factors. At the end of August 2022, I informed the client who hired me that I believed that the Hamlin allegations were plausible and even believable based on a month of research. The client was satisfied with that conclusion and did not wish to fund further research. I was not satisfied with the conclusion and desired to continue the investigation. And in October of 2022, I started a Substack covering the Hamlin case with the goal of generating leads while also offsetting costs through subscription revenues. Over the course of a mere 2 months, I had uncovered corroborative evidence that bolstered the Hamlin sisters' allegations. Their uncle, Timothy Nathan Tuttle, was convicted of molesting his adopted daughter. Tuttle was named as one of the members of the CS by his nieces, as was his wife, David Hamblin's sister, Kristen Tuttle. I would later uncover David Lee Hamblin's connection to Sterling Van Wagenen, the co-founder of the Sundance Film Festival with Robert Redford, who was convicted of SAing a child. Van Wagenen was David Lee Hamblin's patient and an in-law through David Hamblin's wife, Roselle, whose uncle was Dean Van Wagenen. Because 20 years of experience researching pedo rings had led me to data indicating familial and family-specific social connections among perpetrators, I began doing genealogies of the named members of the LDS Church of Satan. This focus was also necessitated by the Hamlin sisters' claim that the CS was a multi-generational group with an obsessive focus on bloodline purity, whose members believed themselves to be of royal satanic bloodlines. As such, the CS focuses on marriages within those bloodlines. Ew. I found that David Lee Hamblin was a distant relative of David Leavitt, the Utah County Attorney and alleged CS member. Hamblin was also related to Lee Bennion, the wife of alleged Spring City CS member Joe Bennion, and Hamblin is Lee Bennion's fourth cousin. I found genealogical connections to various political families, such as the Udalls, Lees, and Bangerters for David Lee Hamblin. This was consistent with the Hamlin sisters' claims that the CS, through marriage and membership, maintains gatekeepers within the political, legal, medical, and psychiatric establishments of Utah and other states who can intercede to obstruct efforts to investigate allegations of abuse by CS members. While this is merely circumstantial evidence, it was yet another factor that did not undermine the Hamblin allegations, but instead added plausibility to their claims. A geographical analysis of the properties owned by CS members corroborated the Hamlin sisters' claims that the CS members move into neighborhoods where the group has an existing presence so that they can be safe or safer to practice their religion. Within certain neighborhoods, the condominiums in Provo, CS members saturated entire streets. Research into their neighbors who initially appeared to have no connection to the CS turned up allegations by children and grandchildren of those neighbors of SA. Through a public archive, I was able to obtain the divorce records of Gordon Bowen, McGarry Bowen founder and advertising executive, who was accused of being a CS member and child rapist by the Hamlin sisters. Those records outline allegations of SA and impropriety against Bowen by his 2 biological children, his stepsons, and his co-workers over 20 years at various advertising agencies, such as Bonneville, Ogilvy Mather, Young and Rubicam, etc. Bowen's divorce records contained journal entries in which he wrote of his sins being foreordained by God so that he could learn the secret codes and combinations, which is Latter-day Saints speak for satanic or occult knowledge. Bowen wrote a story about a young blonde girl standing amidst hundreds of men, feverishly performing Enos pulling exercises, with the girl said to be facing execution for sexual impropriety. Bowen's coworkers spoke of his belief that evil spirits were destroying his home and physically assaulting him from the 1980s onward, with Bowen utilizing that claim to convince male coworkers to spend the night with him in his residence in order to protect him. During those sleepovers, Bowen allegedly sexually fondled his coworkers multiple times. Bowen's friend claimed that he told her that his entire family hopped into bed naked with each other. Annie Pratt, the wife of Tom Pratt, spoke of witnessing a, quote, young, sickly boy in Bowen's Salt Lake mansion before a dinner at Bowen's home. Pratt said the boy told her and her mother that he was staying with Bowen. Bowen's secretary, Michelle Aventaro, stated that a young teenage boy was waiting for him in the cafeteria at his advertising agency, and when she asked him why, the boy replied that Bowen had promised to pay to fix his teeth if he would stay with Bowen in his New York residence. Aventaro also stated that she was aware that Bowen was bringing boys to New York from Utah. She claimed that she was worried the police would find the bodies of these boys underneath Bowen's home. Bowen alleged to his coworkers that his father, Wes, watched as a family member SA'd him in their pool. In the process of identifying the Schroeder kids mentioned in the Hamblin's victim statements, I came across obituaries for two members of the Schroeder family. Anya Schroeder died by suicide in 2011. Schroeder attended sweat lodges conducted by alleged CS member and artist Joe Benyon of Horseshoe Mountain Pottery, where participants disrobed and consumed peyote during the ceremonies. She was a teenager at the time. Her brother Gilbert preceded her death, and he also died by suicide. Now, the youngest Schroeder sibling is the victim in the David Hamblin current case. He was molested by the teenage son of a family his father worked on for a project, and when Gerald Schroeder, his father, became aware of the abuse, he asked for recommendations so that he could retain a psychologist to help his son. Joe Benyon recommended David Lee Hamblin to Schroeder, and Hamblin proceeded to abuse the youngest Schroeder child in a manner consistent with his abuse of multiple other patients, two of whom testified against Hamblin at his trial. Put simply, in a year and 7 months of investigative research, I have found dozens of corroborative pieces of evidence that establish the credibility of the Hamlin sisters and no evidence that debunks their allegations. Over hundreds of pages worth of victim statements, the Hamlin sisters do not contradict each other even though they were in separate rooms filling out their statements. It's virtually impossible to believe that three sisters would concoct a deceitful narrative spanning hundreds of pages detailing thousands of instances of criminal SA, physical abuse, and murder with zero inconsistencies. When taken in context with the corroborative facts listed in the preceding section, the Hamblin sisters' story has added credibility at every turn. Put simply, there are dozens of reasons to believe the Hamblin sisters' story and not a single reason to discredit that story, because there are no inconsistencies in the victim statements, and there are no facts uncovered in a year and 7 months that have called their story into question. Instead, virtually every new revelation bolsters the Hamblin sisters' story.